Welcome to this course, Introduction to Cybersecurity Risk Management, a Practical Primer. My name is Josh Moulin, Principal at Natsar. Risk management is at the foundation of all the things that we do in cybersecurity. Whether you're just getting started in cybersecurity and want to learn more about some of the foundational aspects of cybersecurity and how it ties into risk management, or you've been doing cyber for a while and you just want to learn more about it, this course should give you some good steps and practical tips on how you can better manage cybersecurity risks in your environment. Thanks for watching. Before you dive in, I wanted to share that you can earn continuing education credit for this content. Just visit natsar.com and register for free to access this presentation. Instructions and a link to access it are available below. Upon completion, you'll receive a certificate of attendance, which can be used toward continuing professional education hours. It's our way of giving back to the cybersecurity community. If you find our content helpful, please subscribe to our channel to be notified of future content. Also, feel free to explore our on-demand courses and other valuable cybersecurity resources available at natsar.com. And if you're here to watch without needing a certificate, I hope you enjoy the video. The objectives for this course is first, understand foundational cybersecurity concepts, like how confidentiality, integrity, and availability guide our risk-based decisions. Learn how vulnerabilities, threats, and exposures impact risks and opportunities for organizations. We'll discuss vulnerability and patch management and how to effectively prioritize activities. Review common cybersecurity risk frameworks such as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the NIST Risk Management Framework, the CIS controls, and others. Learn how to use tools such as risk assessments and risk registers to manage and communicate risks to stakeholders and leadership. And discuss practical ways to communicate technical risk to non-technical executives. Now, as I mentioned, this is just a primer, a foundational course in risk management. Although I will have a lot of detail and information in here, I'm also going to be producing some subsequent courses that really deep dive some of these topics that would be great if you are going to be doing this full-time or especially looking into leadership roles in either IT or cybersecurity. So be on the lookout for some future courses on risk management specifically. As I mentioned, my name is Josh Moulin, and I've been doing cybersecurity now for over 20 years. I got my start in law enforcement, where I was the commander of a cybercrimes task force and accredited digital forensics lab. I've been a CIO and CISO within the U.S. Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, an executive partner at Gartner, a senior vice president at the Center for Internet Security, and I now own my own cybersecurity consulting and advisory company called Natsar. I've been given the opportunity to work with and work in a lot of organizations and do a lot of work specifically in risk management. So I hope to bring some of those both academic things that I've picked up and actual real life experience and how to apply some of these things to this course for you. One thing that we're often told to do in cybersecurity is, I need you to secure this, whatever this is. It could be a enterprise class information system, it could be a weapon system, it could be a number of things. But oftentimes we're not given a lot of detail and we feel like we've been deployed to the jungle like I have in this video. The threats could pop out from anywhere. You don't always know your vulnerabilities or how exposed you might be. And some of the threats are very obvious and overt. Some of them are not so obvious and they're hidden. So you have to really be ready for whatever might come your way. And that's why risk management is so important, because we try and figure out, well, what are the known knowns, the things we know we have issues with? What are the known unknowns? We know there's some things that we just don't have enough visibility into or we don't know enough about. And then there's unknown unknowns that are just completely out of the blue, like zero-day attacks and other things that we just don't have information about. So we want to have a holistic risk management program that helps us reduce risk and account for some of these things that might pop out at you when you are trying to secure your organizations. Let's jump into the first module here, Introduction to Cybersecurity Risk Management Core Concepts. Cybersecurity environments are complex and they're getting more and more complex as the time goes on. But it's not always just about the technology. So I've put a few things on this slide for you to consider when you're learning more about risk management or trying to manage risks in your environment. One of the things is just what's the business mission / organization goals, and their risk appetite. You'll hear more about risk appetite as we go along in this course, but risk appetite is really how much risk is the business or the executives or the board willing to take? Where's that threshold between this is something you can handle versus this needs to be bubbled up to executives because it's above the decision-making capability for you or your organization? And you need to know that. That's one of those discussions that needs to be had with leadership is what is okay for me to handle as CIO, CISO, cybersecurity manager, whatever your role may be, versus what do I need to make sure you're informed about? But you also need to know about the business goals. Where are they trying to take things so you can keep that in mind? They may be willing to take on more risk as they develop a new product or as they do some go-to-market work or as they acquire a new company or get a new mission set. Whatever the parameters might be can clearly dictate their risk appetite. Also, what other laws, regulations, and policies are in play? What do you need to be aware of? There might be certain things that you just have to do because it's legally required. Other things you may not be able to do because it's prohibited. How well resourced is IT and cybersecurity in the organization you work in? It's a totally different set of circumstances if you're a one-person cybersecurity team that wears a lot of hats versus a well-resourced, well-funded, large organization that has people doing nothing but risk management full-time plus IT staff plus cybersecurity staff. Now, sometimes risk can be mitigated by just putting money toward it. Maybe it's buying a new piece of technology. That may not be an option if you don't have the budget for it. But oftentimes, risks aren't always mitigated or effectively mitigated just with technology or spending money on it alone. What organizational politics must be navigated? Politics and risk management go hand in hand, and I can tell you I've been in some pretty bloody battles, especially as a CIO and a CISO, when it comes to managing risk within a larger organization. There's lots of politics at play. You really need to have advocates for you and your program throughout the organization. You need to know who, of course, the official leaders are, but you also need to know who those power players are that get things done, have a lot of following within an organization, and get them on your side. A perfect example of this is something like implementing multi-factor authentication in an organization. Yes, it's best practice. Yes, we all should be doing it. But also, yes, it's true, there's a user experience component to that can cause people to have problems, be upset. It can break things if not implemented correctly. You really have to have a pretty big campaign to roll things out like that, and that's where you need to have those political allies. And then also, how much technical debt exists in the organization? How many end-of-life, end-of-support systems have been left out there because there isn't funding or priority to get them refreshed? How many vulnerabilities have not been patched because we just needed to get this thing out the door and then later sometime we'll go back in and patch those things? What are those things that have been ignored, deferred, but now increase the risk to you and the organization that you just need to account for? So in addition to all those non-technical things to think through, there's also just many layers of cybersecurity. Our attack surface is growing rapidly, and we have to defend and protect all of these things. Things like our data. Do we have PII, personally identifiable information? Do we have CUI, controlled and classified information? Do we have law enforcement sensitive or company private or some other intellectual property that's in our systems and networks that we need to protect? The answer to that for almost everyone is yes. What kind of applications do you have running and how should you be protecting those? What about cloud services? Do you know where that line is between what you're responsible for protecting versus what the vendor is responsible for protecting? And do you have that documented? Do you have it incorporated into your incident response plans? Networks, of course, we have to protect. Our end user devices like desktops and laptops. IoT, Internet of Things, continues to sprawl. So you may have all sorts of sensors and thermostats and smart TVs and other things on your network that you now have to accommodate and secure and protect. Mobility, like tablets and mobile phones, introduce their own challenges, and everyone has those on their networks these days. Servers and infrastructure. Do you have a data center? Do you have a co-located facility? Do you have everything in the cloud or some hybrid approach that you have to now secure? And AI is just one example of a number of emerging technologies that you also have to think about from a risk management perspective. Do you allow your employees to copy and paste proprietary information into ChatGPT or Google Gemini, for instance? What technical and administrative controls do you have in place to make sure that you are managing risk with AI and other emerging technologies correctly? And then finally, physical security. It's not all about the ones and zeros. How are you securing your data centers, your network closets, all of the systems and networks and components that you would not want an adversary or even an accidental insider to get access to and do something to? So remember that things like cameras and locks and audit logs are all part of cybersecurity as well. The core foundation for cybersecurity boils down to these three letters: CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's really what we always think of when we determine risk. What's the risk to confidentiality? What's the risk to integrity and availability? And these can often be different depending on the organization and the specific system or application or data set that you're trying to protect. For instance, some things we don't care about the confidentiality of because it's just public information. Like what's the weather today? Maybe we have a sensor on the top of the building that's telling us the temperature and the wind speed and direction. Well, we don't really care who sees that, so confidentiality is a pretty low item on our priority list. However, availability might be very, very high. It might be a mission critical thing. We need to know the weather for whatever reason, so we have to make sure that that is always available. So things that affect availability now become higher on our priority list. Integrity really is talking about, if I send you something, do you receive what I sent you? Can you trust the message? Has it been altered in any way between the sender and the recipient? Or has someone been able to get onto the system and alter or destroy or delete data? Things like that. So that's what we're talking about: confidentiality, integrity, availability, that CIA Triad. And we use that to help defend against another acronym, which of course in cyber we love our acronyms. It's DAD. So disclosure, alteration, and destruction is really what we're trying to prevent with this confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So for example, confidentiality, we're trying to prevent disclosure, unauthorized disclosure, or like a breach of information to someone or some organization that shouldn't have it. Integrity is, has it been altered? We're trying to prevent against alteration, like I mentioned in the last slide. And then finally, destruction. We want to make sure that our systems are running. They're not destroyed or completely taken offline by a denial of service attack or a ransomware attack or something like that. They need to be available for us when we need to get into them. And if availability is super high priority, then you do lots of redundant things like redundant power supplies, redundant network interface cards, all sorts of different things to make sure that, sometimes physically different hardware, like an HA pair, high availability pair for firewalls, where you actually have two of the devices, and if one fails, it automatically fails over to another one. So those are examples of availability mitigating controls that you might put in place. So we'll talk about a number of sources and targets of cyber threats. So the first is people. Of course, social engineering, like phishing attacks, shoulder tapping, and piggybacking into organizations through badged entry doors. All sorts of social engineering attacks and manipulation, even misinformation, are all targeted towards people in your organization. Then processes is another source and target of cyber threats. So things like supply chain attacks. Think of attacks like Kaseya and SolarWinds and Microsoft and others, where the supply chain was actually infiltrated, and when organizations downloaded what they thought was legitimate software, they actually compromised themselves. So that's a process example of an attack. And then, of course, technology. Things like scanning for vulnerabilities and then trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. So exploiting known or unknown vulnerabilities via cyber attack is an example. So people, process, technology, those are all sources of cyber threats and targets of cyber threats that we just want to keep in mind as we go throughout this course, but then of course your career. All right, now that we've talked about people and processes and technology and different sources and targets of threats, I want to talk a little bit about understanding threats and exposures and vulnerabilities specifically. And this will be really important to be able to get your mind around as we go through and for your career, because each of these have a different aspect to consider when you're talking about risk management. So let's give an example here that has nothing to do with cybersecurity, but something we can all relate to. And we'll talk about how the exposure to some sort of a threat makes a difference. So in this slide, I have the asset, which is a car. The threat is a hailstorm. The exposure is different. We have on the top a parking garage, and on the bottom is that asset, the car, sitting outside. So the same asset, the same threat, two different exposures. When we look at how this plays out, if we see the car is threatened by a hailstorm, the car that's sitting, that exact same car sitting inside a garage, well, obviously there's going to have a little bit of a different outcome. And if you see on the right hand side, for this example, we have the same asset, a car, the same threat, a hailstorm, the same vulnerability. That car is built the exact same way, has the same materials, has the same glass, whether it's sitting in a parking garage or it's sitting outside, but the exposure is different. So if you're lucky and you've got the car in the garage and a hailstorm comes by, well, you don't really have anything to worry about. If you're unlucky and you couldn't find a parking spot in the garage and you're parked outside and that hailstorm comes by, well, you may have dents and a broken windshield. So you can see the exposure makes a big difference on whether or not what your outcome is going to look like based on having the exact same threat and the same asset. Now let's take that sample and move it into a cybersecurity realm. So in this instance, we have the same asset is a server. We have a server sitting in a data center. The threat is ransomware. The exposure, on one hand, we have a server sitting in a data center that's got a ransomware attack being levied against it, but this server is sitting behind a layered defense or defense in depth network. So it's got intrusion detection and prevention, next-gen firewall, endpoint detection and response, offline backups, all the best practices you would think of for combating ransomware. Versus on the bottom, we have just a basic firewall with no other protection. So yes, it has a firewall, but it doesn't have any of those other things that I just mentioned. Well, you can expect that the exposure that that server is facing is much greater sitting just behind a basic firewall than it would be in the layered defense model that I mentioned. It may not even be able to be attacked in that layered defense model. That attack may come in and be thwarted by a number of those defense in depth technologies and policies that might take care of it, where on the other hand, the exposure to the same threat and the same asset would be vastly different if it's just behind a standard firewall, for instance. So that's how exposures can impact cybersecurity threats. Now let's move to the vulnerability to threats. So this is really, what is the degree that an asset is vulnerable to threats? And of course, it will influence the outcomes also. So again, not a cybersecurity example, but one that we can probably relate to. The threat is a threat of wildland fire or wildfire. The asset is a house. The exposure is the same. So in this example, think about a neighborhood that has several houses and they're all being threatened by a wildland fire coming toward them. So the assets are the same, they're houses. The threat is the same, it's the fire. The exposure is the same, that fire is coming toward those houses. However, the construction of the asset is going to make a big difference. So while the assets are all houses, there's going to be a varying degree with how those houses are constructed. So here's a great example of how you might see the outcome be altered. So both these houses are in the exact same neighborhood. Let's say they're on a couple acre lots each. You have the one on the left that is a modern construction building. It has a metal roof. It has fire resistant technologies and building construction materials. It has a nice defensible space around it where it doesn't have combustible materials right up against it, versus the picture on the right where you see a wood construction building, shake roof. It's got, dry grass right up underneath the deck. It has a wood pile stack there. When that fire comes up to these two homes, there most likely is going to be a very big difference between which home is standing and which isn't by the time that fire gets by. So if we look at this in this view here about the outcomes, we have an asset as a house. We have the threat of wildland fire, and we have different vulnerabilities. We've got the house that has very few vulnerabilities because they've done such a good job of defensible space, versus the house below has all sorts of vulnerabilities: the roof, the dry grass, the stacked wood, just the construction in general. So different vulnerability, different outcome for these. Now let's take that into a cybersecurity realm. So again, we have an asset that's a server, we have the threat as ransomware, and we have one server that is fully patched, and we have another server that's completely unpatched. So you can see which one we would be more worried about obviously would be the one that hasn't been patched appropriately. So that just gives us some hopefully concept of how threats and exposures and vulnerabilities all work together to help determine what the outcome could be. Now let's go on to the second module to talk about cybersecurity, vulnerability, and patch management specifically. There is a formula for cyber threats, and we just went through it in those pictures that I was showing you earlier, and that's threat plus vulnerability plus exposure equals the risk. So in the diagram I have on the left, you see the overlapping Venn diagram looking thing there with risk really in the middle. Is how does the threat, the vulnerability, and exposure come together to give you the risk that you need to address. So just purely for definitions here, I've got on the slide: a threat is a potential cause of harm, such as a cyber attack or natural disaster. Remember, even though we're talking about cyber threats, that could also be non-cyber attacks. So it could be power outages, it could be hurricanes or tornadoes or other natural disasters that all are risks to our organizations. A vulnerability, a weakness or flaw that can be exploited by a threat. Things like unpatched software or poor configurations, or in my previous example, a house poorly constructed in the middle of the forest. Exposure is the degree to which an asset is accessible or subject to the threat. So think about public-facing systems, lack of firewalls, so the car, whether it's in the garage or sitting outside. So this is how these three things, the threat, the vulnerability, and the exposure, all come together to give you the risk that you need to be concerned about and understanding how to mitigate. Now, vulnerabilities and exploitation are not the same. You'll hear lots of reports about the hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities that are known, and how many vulnerabilities are being discovered and what patches are available. And while that's very interesting and helpful information for us to track, it needs to be remembered that a vulnerability without an exploit is different than a vulnerability with an exploit. So on this chart here, you see within 1 year from IBM in 2023, there was almost 24,000 vulnerabilities identified in that year. This isn't all vulnerabilities. There's about 250,000, I think, known documented vulnerabilities in existence. Of those 24,000 vulnerabilities detected, only about 6,300, you see 6,290 down below, are exploitable. So yes, we need to know about all those 24,000, but really the ones that we care about are that 6,300-ish number that can actually be exploited by an attacker. And we're going to deep dive this in just a minute, but it is important to remember that yes, we need to know about vulnerabilities in our environment, but we need to prioritize those systems that have vulnerabilities that are exploitable vulnerabilities the highest. Those are the ones we need to deal with first and take most serious from a risk management perspective. Now, adversaries continue to exploit old vulnerabilities, and it's just amazing to me. I've gone on a number of incident response cases where we find out that the system was attacked by a vulnerability that has been known for years and patches have been available for it, and it just never got applied. And like this saying here on the slide, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And it really is true. We see a lot of adversaries get successful breaches and footholds into networks by just low-hanging fruit, exploiting known vulnerabilities. And you see here on the slide that 91% of vulnerabilities exploited are more than 3 years old. So things just sitting out there that are very old and being exploited all the time. So how do you prioritize vulnerability management? If you're in IT or you're a cybersecurity professional that maybe provides insight or advice to IT, remember that we need to focus on certain things to be the most effective. So I mentioned this already. There are about 250,000 known vulnerabilities in existence. Of that 250,000, about 15,000 have exploits available. So this means out of all the published vulnerabilities that exist, only about 6% of them can actually be exploited. So you can really get wrapped around on how many vulnerabilities you have in your network and how many exposures, and it can sometimes be a pretty large number. But first of all, just to cut a lot of noise out, focus on just those 6% that can actually be exploited. Of course, you do want to fix as much as you can, but don't start with ones that can't be exploited. Put your effort into the high risk, the ones that can be exploited first. So another way to say that, or graphically anyway, is be smart about how you patch your system. So in this chart here, I've got all disclosed vulnerabilities in the big circle. So all that 250,000 that we just talked about. Then we see exploitable vulnerabilities on that upper circle. So that 15,000-ish number that has exploitable vulnerabilities. But then we really care about vulnerabilities in your environment. So you've got all vulnerabilities known to anybody, those that have exploits, those vulnerabilities in your environment, and then that overlap of vulnerabilities in your network or on your systems or in your enterprise. And then the overlap is those in your environment that are exploitable. So on average, it's about 6%. That's where you start. You focus on those first before anything else, if you can, to try and significantly reduce the risk of compromise within your organization. Now, there's a few other strategic things to think through with vulnerability risk management and how you strategically address this. First is mitigate high value assets, or HVAs, first. What I mean by that is you should have, if you don't already, a list somehow, whether it's in a spreadsheet or in an asset management software application. What are your high value assets? For instance, the domain controllers should be more valuable than the intern's laptop, for example, or a mission critical database or application server or something like that that has running on it something that if it went down, it would cripple your organization. Those should be on your high value asset lists. You want to focus on mission and business critical systems next. So you've got your high value assets are the very first things you focus. Then mission and business critical systems, and those that may contain something like PII, that personally identifiable information. Then use a risk-based approach for patching. Patch domain controllers, for example, before desktops. So now if we step back to that chart I showed before, where all the vulnerabilities that exist, all the vulnerabilities in your environment, and then those that have exploits. So now let's really put the aperture down on just those vulnerabilities in your environment with known exploits. Start with high value assets first. Those are the ones we're going to go after, and we're going to patch those first or somehow mitigate them if it's not just a patch. Then we're going to look at mission and business critical systems next. And then you go on from there, depending on your organization and how you've defined your risk. You also want to consider the criticality of the vulnerability. So layer on another thing to consider, and that's something like the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, the CVSS, of is this a critical vulnerability, or is this, yes, it can be exploited, but it would require all of these things to fall into place before an adversary could exploit it. So the higher the CVSS score, the more critical that it is. So you would want to patch a CVSS score of 9 on a domain controller with a vulnerability that has an exploit before you're patching CVSS score of 4 on just an end user desktop, for example. You want to remediate only those with vulnerabilities in your enterprise with known exploits first, then worry about patching non-exploitable vulnerabilities second. And monitor threat intelligence for changes in exploits, because these things change all the time. Now, hear me on this. I'm not saying don't jam out patches on Patch Tuesday or whatever you're doing. I mean, keep doing those things. But if you're going to sit down and take time to determine what we should be patching, do something like this. Have a strategy, have a risk-based approach, because it's embarrassing for organizations to say, well, yep, all of our desktops are patched pretty well, but our mission critical systems are not patched, and that's where the adversary was able to get into our network and steal all of our data. So you really do want to start with the things that are going to be the most problematic or get people into the most amount of trouble first based on their risk, and then look at those other things. Another thing that you can use is what's called the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE. These are now tracked at CVE.org. It's a website you can go to hosted by MITRE that allows you to search for all of those 250,000 vulnerabilities that I mentioned. And when a vulnerability is discovered and disclosed and reviewed, it is then issued a CVE number that has the year of when it was identified, and then a unique number after that, and it allows a CVE to be tracked. So if you know a CVE number, you can put that number in here and it'll pull up all the information about it, or you can search for any vulnerability that's been identified for Windows 11 or for IPv6 or for whatever it is you're looking for. You can put it in this website. You can also download the entire list. You can use an API to be querying this if you're using it with some sort of threat intelligence system or vulnerability scanning engine. So this is just a great resource. If you're not familiar with it already, it's something you probably want to bookmark. Now, I mentioned the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. This is available on first.org's website /CVSS. It's now on version 4.0. And there's a lot that goes into how they come up with the scoring system. It's actually pretty detailed about a number of different factors of how they come up with the number. And if you do vulnerability management full-time, it's probably good to deep dive this yourself and understand how they come up with the numbers. But for most of us, we really are looking at how easily is a vulnerability exploited, and is it something that requires no user interaction, for instance, to get full admin privileges on a system, versus something that they'd have to have someone click or install some second stage malware in order for it to work. Obviously, all of those things we care about, but we really want to focus on those CVSS scores that are the highest, with all the other factors included that I already went through. I mentioned that there's a lot to the CVSS scoring. It is pretty complex. You can see on the top here the basic things that they use. There's a base metric, and then threat metric, and environmental metric, and supplemental metric. So there's lots that go into these numbers. But then on the bottom, I've got just the rating. So rating of 0 is, no vulnerability there. A low, medium, high, and a critical is anything with a CVSS score of 9 or above. Another thing that you should add to your list of resources, if you're not familiar with this already, is CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the US, with their catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities, or the KEV. This is a catalog maintained by CISA of those exploits that have, those vulnerabilities that have known exploits. And generally, these are things they're seeing actively exploited in the wild. So this is a really good thing to keep an eye on. And generally, they'll do some sort of a release when they add something to the KEV. So this is kind of your worst of the worst, America's most wanted kind of vulnerabilities that you want to make sure you're aware of in your organization. And if you have any of these that are in the KEV in your organization that have not yet been mitigated, those definitely should be on your top hit list to go take care of. Now we'll move on to the next module, assessing information technology and cybersecurity risk. Remember CIA, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability that I mentioned earlier. We're now going to use that to contextualize our risk. So for example, I mentioned you may have a system where the confidentiality doesn't matter. It's the data that comes from the weather sensor on the roof of your building. We don't care who sees that necessarily, but the availability is really important. So if we were doing a risk assessment of our network or our enterprise, we would probably say confidentiality is none, or if none isn't an option, then at least low. Integrity, well, we probably want to make sure that the data that we're receiving is accurate. It's not being messed with by something in the middle, so we might say it's medium or high. And availability might be medium or high depending on your particular set of circumstances. So this is how we generally use confidentiality, integrity, and availability when we think through system risk assessments and security planning. There's a federal government FIPS 199, FIPS 199, that goes into great detail about how to use this for federal systems, but many organizations use it even if they're not a U.S. federal agency. But it's a pretty easy thing to do, and the nice thing is this helps us then go to the next stage, which is determining what security controls we should be putting in place on our system. So if confidentiality, for example, is not an issue for us, we don't care about it, it's none or low, well, we're not going to put a lot of time or effort into things like applying encryption at rest or in transit. It might be something we already have done because it's just built into the software, but if we've got that versus redundant power supplies or redundant cabling or whatever, because availability is more important, we're going to put our effort, money, and time into making sure the availability is taken care of first. So that's why it's nice to have these, you'll hear people say, well, it's low, low, high. That would mean it's always in this order: confidentiality, integrity, availability. So if somebody says, well, the information system is low, low, medium, that would be low confidentiality, low integrity, medium availability. Sometimes you have high straight across the board. Depending on this set of circumstances, as I mentioned, is also what security controls you're going to put into place, and then how granular and how important some of those security controls will be. This is based on NIST 830, and it's the same out of FIPS 199, how to do a risk assessment categorization. So the way that they talk about it here is security objectives are on the left. So again, that's CIA that we've been talking about: confidentiality, integrity, availability. And then along the top, low, moderate, or high. So in this particular example, these are your three options. It must be one of these three. So confidentiality low would say the unauthorized disclosure of information could be expected to have, and I've got bolded, a limited adverse effect on organizational operations, organizational assets, or individuals. If we went to moderate, it would have a serious adverse effect, and high would be severe or catastrophic. And the same thresholds are used for integrity and availability. So when you're thinking through categorizing a system, and a system could be an entire global network with all computers and servers and networks and everything as one system, or it could be a single computer or an application or server that could be a system, depending on how you are using this. But also, once you have a watermark of the highest level in any of these three categories, that's generally what the system overall will be classified. So if you've got low, low, high, then it's a high system. You may only apply low security controls for confidentiality and low for integrity, but then when you get to availability, you're going to be doing all of the maximum controls that you can for that system. So that watermark is important to know. What's the highest level of any of these three? And then that's generally, again, what that system is going to be classified as. We get our information from a number of sources to help us inform our overall risk snapshot of our organization. Things like vulnerability scans. So hopefully you're doing, or will do when you get into cybersecurity as a career, regular vulnerability scans, or you have somebody doing those for you and providing you the results. Making sure you're finding the vulnerabilities that are out there, that you're not part of that 90+% that has vulnerabilities sitting out there unpatched for more than 3 years and getting compromised that way. You're using those scans to find out what's in your enterprise, what vulnerabilities exist, and of those vulnerabilities that exist, which ones have known exploits. And then you might have something called a POA&M, which I'll talk about in a little bit, a plan of action and milestones. This is something to help offset that technical debt that we talked about a little bit ago, where you document things that come up short with systems, but you need to get the system in service. And maybe it's a lower risk, someone has accepted the risk. For instance, you might say, well, we need to get this application online, but unfortunately the application only allows an 8-character password, but our policy is 15. So someday we're going to have developers fix that. So we're going to add that to a POA&M, that the code will be adjusted to allow for a 15-character minimum password that has all the complexity requirements. But we're going to mitigate that by doing some other control, so we don't, maybe multi-factor authentication or something like that, where it's really not as big of a deal. Sometimes there is no mitigating control and someone just has to accept that risk. But those are the kinds of things that you would put on a POAM. A risk register. I'm going to talk a lot more about risk registers in just a bit, but this is a huge source of information and something that you really should be doing if you don't already have a risk register established. Also, configuration compliance. So how compliant are our systems with known good standard baseline configurations? Things like gold images you might hear of, where we use a hardened image for all of our desktops and all of our laptops and our servers. So you might use the CIS controls to create those and the benchmarks. You might also use DISA STIGs or USGCB or other standards that help you securely harden and implement operating systems and other applications in a way that is less susceptible to attacks. And then also CTI, cyber threat intelligence, where you're getting information about the tactics and techniques and procedures that adversaries are using, the new vulnerabilities that are being discovered, new exploits that are being published. All of these things create just a lot of information that gets funneled down into how you are assessing and addressing risk across your organization. We want to focus on eliminating those highest impact risks first. And you probably remember me going through high value assets, exploits in your environment with known vulnerabilities. That's kind of what I'm talking about here, but this is a little bit broader where we're just talking about all risks. So while that flowchart I kind of went through verbally with you before for patching is great for patching, it doesn't address other sources of risk, like a risk for a tsunami or a risk for an earthquake or other things that you may have to deal with from a cybersecurity perspective. So here we want to think through 4 main questions when we look at how risky is something that we're aware of. First is the impact. What effect will this risk have on, now I say the business, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a government agency, it could be a number of things, but just generally here I'm using business. If it occurs. So what is the impact if this happens? What's the probability? So how likely is this risk to occur? There's some things that would be catastrophic if they happen, but they're so unlikely that we're able to offset some of it because of that probability. And then the criticality. How important is this system? You might have something that would have a high impact and a high probability, but the bottom line is it's only going to affect one little part of your organization that if they were down for a couple of days wouldn't really be that big of a deal. And then cost. How much would it cost to mitigate the risk, but also how much does it cost not to mitigate it? And this is a real business decision that organizations have to go through. I've actually seen organizations that say, yes, we know we're not PCI, the payment card industry, compliant, but it would actually cost us more money to be compliant than to just get the fine for not being compliant. Now, I'm not saying that's an ethical decision, but I have seen organizations make decisions like that where they say, we'll just take the risk, and if we get fined, it's still cheaper than if we were to go out and invest everything needed to do what we needed to do. I think it's pretty short-sighted, especially when you think about the cost of litigation, but those are the costs associated with risk management and the things that executives are sometimes looking at. Now let's take an example here of a threat analysis that you might do for a piece of hardware. But it could be used for anything, but I just wanted to show this as an example for a piece of hardware. So you were given the task of looking at this walkie-talkie, this portable radio that's being used by the military to see what risks are present, what potential threats could this thing be facing. So you might look at things like, well, first of all, are the transmissions encrypted? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. From the confidentiality side, do we need to worry about, could somebody eavesdrop and could an adversary listen to what we're saying and know our location and what our plans are? Maybe things that aren't as obvious as voice, but is there some beaconing or something that goes on if we just change the channel? Could an adversary tell what channel we're operating from? What if we use these to track soldiers with the GPS module? What happens if that GPS module fails? Is there a warning? Is there a backup system, something else on the soldier that could be used? Is it just totally dead? What do you have to think about there? Also, who makes the circuit board? Where are they sourced? Do you have a supply chain vulnerability here? Do you find out that the circuit board is manufactured in a different country that's an adversary to your organization, and perhaps there's some sort of backdoor or other way for them to subvert security controls that you put in place? And then what about, is there any data on this device? What if one of these devices were lost or stolen or somehow captured? Could an adversary do forensics on the device or somehow get information off that device that could help them and hurt us? So this is just an example of a threat analysis that you might do on a device, and also just to get you thinking of that confidentiality, integrity, availability, and how you would apply it in a real world situation. Now I'm using a piece of hardware here, but you could also do these same kinds of things for a software application as well. So when you know you have risks and you've documented those risks, there's a couple strategies that you can choose from. So you've got the risk in the middle here. You can just avoid it. You can say, we're not going to do that. So because we're not doing that, the risk no longer exists. You can transfer the risk. This is insurance. So you can say, there's a risk that my house might burn down, but I'm transferring that risk to my insurance company and I'm paying them money to deal with that. So if it does happen, they will pay for it and I don't have to save the money to buy another house. I can just accept it. I can say, yep, that's a risk. Got it. We'll write it down, but we're not going to do anything about it. Or we can try and reduce the risk. We can say, I understand this is a risk. If we do the following things, maybe administrative controls, technical controls, implement some technology, the risk may still be there ultimately, but the likelihood of it actually happening is going to go way down. So we're going to reduce our risk. Now, risks aren't always bad. Usually we think about risks as some sort of a threat, and most of the time that's what we are looking at. But there's also opportunity risks. It could be it's always risky to do a merger or an acquisition or go after some new line of business. That's a risk, but that could be a very good thing. So there's two options if you're looking at opportunity risks, and that is exploit it. You found it and you want to go after it, so you're going to exploit whatever that situation is, or enhance it. You're going to make it better or make it bigger or whatever the enhancement may be. So those are your two strategies when it comes to opportunity risks. But the ones I have on the graphic there are all related to risks that are more threats. Now, with cloud infrastructure in particular, or any system that you have hosted by someone else and like a software as a service or infrastructure as a service, it is important, as I mentioned earlier, to know where that cutoff line is between what you're responsible for securing versus what they're being the vendor, responsible for doing. So this is just a graphic that shows on the far left, a traditional data center. You're responsible for the whole stack, the data, the apps, the middleware, the OSs, any virtualization, the physical hardware, the servers, the storage, the networking, and the actual physical security of the entire data center itself. Now, if you co-locate, you're still on the hook for a lot of it, but the network you share with the co-location facility, but the actual physical infrastructure, you're not responsible for securing. And then you see hosting. So this is where you just have somebody providing you hardware and you're dealing with the rest of the stack. And then we move over to more of the traditional IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS models. So I'm going to skip IaaS and PaaS. You can certainly read those on your own. But then SaaS is what a lot of people like because pretty much everything except the actual data is on the vendor to secure. So think of things like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. I'm not going in patching Microsoft servers that are running Exchange Online or Active Directory Online or any of those things. I am only worried about my data. Although it's stored in their infrastructure, I make sure that it's tagged appropriately and I have data loss prevention set up and all sorts of other policies and rules that they provide me the ability to do. So that's on me, but the rest of it is on them to deal with. I'm not doing scanning, I'm not doing patching, any of that stuff. So that's why it costs more money from an operational perspective, where on the left-hand side, we have a lot more capital expenses, but there's pros and cons to each, and there are requirements for each. So you might work in an environment where you have to have on-prem systems. Maybe it's a classified network or something like that. Well, you're going to be on the far left of this screen. Maybe you're just a business that runs everything SaaS. You use Google Workspace and Dropbox and Adobe Creative Cloud and maybe Canva and a few other things. Well, that's all SaaS. It's all going to be on the far right. And you may not dabble at all in the middle depending on your organization. Now that we've talked about risks and understanding the differences between threats and vulnerabilities and exposures and different levels of risk and prioritization, one way to really understand what risk is in your network, in your enterprise, in your business, is to use a framework. And like I have on the subtitle here, all models are wrong, but some are useful. There's never going to be one that's absolutely perfect for everybody, but these 4 that I have up here are by far the most common. The CIS, Center for Internet Security Controls, are a great set of 18 controls that are broken into implementation groups. They're called IGs. There's 3 implementation groups. Depending on the risk to your organization that you have to worry about, you would do, everybody does IG1, implementation group 1. It's kind of considered basic cyber hygiene. And then IG2 are for organizations that have more risk. And then IG3 would be for your highest level risk organizations. They are a really easy to use, well-resourced set of controls. I'm a little biased because I mentioned I was a senior vice president at CIS for several years, but I really like how CIS has this laid out. And if you're not using any, I would steer you toward the CIS controls. I think they are the easiest to use. And like I said, they're well documented. And I'll even show you a few resources as we go with CIS. CISA has something that came out recently called the Cybersecurity Performance Goals, or CPGs. They're very similar to the CIS controls. They've done a few things a little bit different, but you can download them from CISA's website. Then we also have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF. They have what's called profiles for different organizations, so the controls that are involved here get tailored, whether you're a drinking water utility or energy utility versus a K through 12 school. Obviously, the risks and threats are different between those, so things are tailored accordingly. And then if you're a U.S. federal agency or a contractor to a federal agency, you might have to use what's called the RMF, the Risk Management Framework, also from NIST. That's pretty complex, and again, it's really for federal information systems. They're required by law to use it. But a lot of contractors also have to go through the NIST RMF. If you aren't doing federal contracting work, you can certainly look through it. It's NIST 853 if you want to see all the controls and information, but I would not do it unless you either want to read a lot or you're required to do that for some reason. I would say NIST, CSF, and the CIS controls are probably the most popular. I've got a few honorable mentions down below. ISO, COBIT, CMMC for organizations doing contracting to the Department of Defense in the United States now have to comply with CMMC, which is also very similar to the CIS controls and the CISA CPGs. SOC 2, PCI DSS are all other frameworks. The bottom line is that these are about 80 to 90% the same. So you really want to pick one that you like, you can work with easily. And the nice thing about these, if you've never looked at them, is it gives you a list of controls that you should be putting into place. And it'll ask you questions. Do you have multi-factor authentication for this? Do you use least privileged access? And do you have administrative controls different from regular controls? And how do you vet users? And do you shut off accounts when people leave the organization? And it's really just a suite of cybersecurity best practices that you can go through and self-score yourself and then say, well, I'm really good in these areas, but I'm not so good here. So this is going to be the area we're going to focus on next year, for instance. So you want to do a risk assessment and you want to compare where you're at today with where you need to be or want to be in the future. And then you can create that burn down list of things that you want to go tackle based on what it is that you find out. Now, CIS has a great website called the Controls Navigator, and I'll show you a video here of how it works. What it allows you to do is pick all of these different control families that are out there. I mentioned a few of them already: CMMC, ISO, PCI DSS, etc. And you can map the CIS controls to those, and they will show you the delta between the two. So if you've already assessed your organization, let's say to the CIS controls version 8, implementation group 1, and then you're told, we need you to be PCI DSS compliant. Well, you can take your assessment for CIS controls and use this controls navigator to see, well, what are the things that PCI requires that you didn't quite get to with the CIS IG1? And then you just have to go tackle those couple things that fall out, because if you've documented your program under the CIS controls, then you know that you have that all covered based on the work you've already done. Now, a risk register is one of the most powerful tools that you can use as an IT and cybersecurity professional. When I I joke about this sometimes, but one of these earned me about $2 million one year. And the way that worked is I had created a whole risk register for my organization when I was a CIO. And I did this also when I was a CISO. And I had things on there that were risks to the enterprise, things like end of life and end of support systems and phone systems that needed to be upgraded and other risks for telecom and things that were identified. And I had not only what the risk was, but I had this if-then statement that you see on this screen. And if this were to fail, then here's the impact. And it's really important to show organizations, especially leaders that are not technical, if this firewall that's beyond end of life fails, then it's going to take down the following things: the 911 center, the fire department, the public works, etc. And when they start talking about enterprise risk, this is going to have to rank up pretty high versus some other risks that might traditionally have been important to consider, but now everything's so technical and relies on IT so much that they have to consider these other IT risks that may not have been considered in the past. If you're looking for, this is a screenshot of the risk register. I couldn't fit it all on here because it's pretty lengthy, but if you're looking for a risk register template, I have one available on Natsar's website. I've got the link down below that you can pick up, and it even has calculations for you. So when you fill things in, it'll automatically calculate your risk level. And this is a great way of just tracking all of the risks in your organization and having a nice way, because at the very end, you also put how much it's going to cost to remediate. So when I joked about getting $2 million from this one spreadsheet, what happened one year is my CFO came to me and said, we have some extra money at the end of the year. What should we consider spending it on in your department, if anything? And I pulled out my risk register and I said, if I could get $2 million, I could knock out the top 10 most risks in our enterprise based on my risk register. And I had already done the math and figuring out how much it would cost with hardware, software, implementation, consulting, etc. And he looked at it and he said, done. And I got the $2 million and I tackled those 10 risks. So this is just a really great way to have it there. Leaders love it because of that very reason. If they've got funding they need to do something with and you have it all ready to go, then you're pretty likely to get funding, especially if it's a risk that affects a large part of the enterprise. I mentioned earlier the POA&Ms, a plan of action, a milestone. This is just an example of what this looks like. And essentially this is you documenting there's a system online that doesn't meet our requirements, and here's the things that it doesn't meet. Here's who's responsible for making sure it happens. Here's the next time we're going to check to see if anything has changed. And here's the security control that is lacking. And then what needs to be done. So you have this list as well of things that need to happen. All right, we are on the home stretch now, the last module of this course, Enterprise Risk Management and Communicating with Executives. One thing that I want to leave you with is it's great to have all of this information at your fingertips, and having a risk register and the POA&Ms and having a risk assessment. Those are all things you need to do. But then you really do need to understand what your boss and what your boss's boss cares about and what their risk appetite is, and also be very careful about how you communicate risk to them. And what I mean by that is I've seen people fall into the trap of saying, well, if we just spent more money on cybersecurity, we would be better. And you might be better, but what you don't want executives to think is there's a direct correlation between budget and risk, because oftentimes there's so many risks out there that you could never throw enough money at cybersecurity to get it where you just don't have to worry about it anymore. So one way that I like to communicate with executives is this approach here, where I talk about, well, you may have less complex of a business, so you're less of a target. So we might not be spending as much on cybersecurity, and that may be okay if you're just a business that you're not on anyone's radar. There's no reason anyone would go after you. Of course, there's always script kiddies and other people that may come after you just for opportunity reasons, but you're not an actual target of like a nation state or something like that. So your risk may be a little higher because you're not doing as much from a cybersecurity perspective. You're not hiring as many people or putting as many technologies in place. They just need to understand that, and ultimately they have to accept that risk. But then maybe your business starts growing. You have more operations, more complexity going on, and now you should be commensurate with the operations and complexity, moving cybersecurity in this direction as well. And then you may have a large, complex business. You are a target. Maybe you have the attention of foreign governments or of adversarial attackers that are going after you to get your intellectual property or to just shut you down, or competitors are coming after you to shut you down. The risk may be lower because you're spending higher money in cybersecurity. Again, we want to be careful not to say protection equals the amount of money that you spend. But what I like to show here is this continuum of leaders have to think through, as the business changes, so does the cybersecurity requirements. So it can't be 10 years ago we had 2 cybersecurity people and we were bringing in $2 million of revenue. Now we're bringing in $50 million of revenue, but we still have those 2 cybersecurity people. There's got to be an investment in cyber, and it needs to come along with the complexity and the amount of targeting going on with that business. Another thing that I find people getting in trouble with, especially CISOs and cybersecurity people, is knowing about risks. Well, 2 things. One, they don't know about the risks because they've never done anything I've talked about. They've never sat people down and said, what are the risks that we have? And one thing, just a side note back on the risk register, one thing that I did is I brought in all of the supervisors and managers that worked for me when I was a CIO. And many of these people, there was multiple layers between them and me on the org chart. But I wanted them because they work in this day in and day out. So I wanted the boots on the ground assessment of what do we have that's risky? And I told them it doesn't matter how small it may be. And I was amazed at some of the things I found out. I found out we had multiple single points of failure across our network. I found out things were end of life, into support. Things were held together literally by rubber bands. And, it was just kind of crazy, some of the stuff that I found out about. And I think it was eye-opening. I had all the leadership in the room when we did this, and we were putting all of these things down. I had that spreadsheet up live in the conference room, and I was just typing as people were telling me what they knew about. But it was my job then to distill all that down, take my first crack at, okay, what's really important versus, yes, those are things that need to be taken care of, but I can handle that as CIO. And then those ones that I thought were really a big deal, I needed to make sure that my boss was aware of that. And this is where I'm going with this slide. So people get into problems with two ways. One is they've never done that exercise and they really don't know what risks are out there, and they get caught off guard. They get breached by a vulnerability that's been out there for 3 years that they never patched. And it looks like they were incompetent, so they get fired. Another is they knew about the risks, but they never told anybody about them. And now it all sits with you specifically, and that's a really bad place to be in. So that's where we see CISOs and other people getting fired. And like I have in this screen, when a bank is robbed, how often do you see the bank manager, the branch manager getting fired? Well, hardly ever, because banks have money. Banks are robbable by their just existence. You can walk in and you can demand money from the teller and get however much you can get. And just by its nature, that can happen by no fault of the branch manager. But IT is kind of the same way. IT systems are hackable. They're online, they have data, they're a target to adversaries, much like a bank is. So then why, when we see an organization get hacked, do we see often the CISO is out the door almost immediately? Well, a lot of this comes down to a communications problem. The CISO did not do a good job in many cases of telling the leaders what I'm telling you right now, in that here's all the risks that we know about, and here's our risk assessments that we have done, and here's where we stack up from a capability standpoint, and making sure that that information isn't just sitting with the CISO, but it's been shared. And then it's a joint responsibility. And if the CISO understands the risk appetite and tolerance of the organization, and the organization understands where they stand from a risk management point from an IT and cyber perspective, that's a much better place to be in. Also remember that cybersecurity risk is not an IT problem. It's not a technical problem. If you're on the high wire here trying to balance all of this as the cybersecurity person, that is a very, very dangerous position to be in. You want to be in the position I mentioned before, where you're having open conversations about this with leadership. You're showing them your risk register. And sometimes I've seen cybersecurity leaders, they're embarrassed. They don't want to admit that they have these risks. They don't want to talk about the vulnerabilities in the environment because they feel like they've failed something. But I've always been much more willing to go to my leadership and say, we've discovered all of these things and we've got some real risks here. And here's my strategy of getting rid of this, but I'm going to need some more resources and your buy-in to make sure that we're on the same page, but also that I can get done what I need to get done. Because sometimes the risk is actually people doing things they shouldn't be doing, like business units contracting with vendors that were never approved, or storing things in inappropriate or unauthorized containers, or who knows what. So then that's where that politics comes into play, where you need leadership on your side to go tell people you can't be doing this stuff anymore. There's policies against this, or there's reasons why you shouldn't be or can't be doing that. There's laws, there's regulations, etc. So you never want cybersecurity risk to be seen as this technical IT problem that somebody else is dealing with, because that's where you can get into a lot of trouble and end up being one of those CISOs or cybersecurity leaders that's out the door as soon as something bad happens. Again, understanding the risk and the risk appetite is critical. So this does require purposeful discussions with leadership about risk management, risk appetite, and reporting thresholds. Where I've worked in the past, we've had written policies on enterprise risk management that clearly defined the level at which I can control things at my level versus what needed to be escalated to my boss versus what had to go all the way up to an enterprise risk management board. And I had many things when I was a CIO that went all the way up to that board. So when they looked at the entire organization and they set budgets and strategies for the next year, they were looking at things like, well, this is a life safety issue for this business unit versus this is a cyber risk from our IT and cybersecurity team. But it could also be life safety because if 911 went down, that's clearly an issue. Or we're contractually required to have this kind of system up and running, but it's not working right now. Or whatever the case is, you want them to have that level of view at their level so they can prioritize things. Now, if they say, we're going to focus this year on buying new fire engines and medical equipment, and we're going to put your stuff on hold, well, that's up to them, but at least you're not making that decision. And if something were to happen, they knew about it. It's been clearly discussed and publicized, and the organization knows, the leadership knows. It's not just on you to try and fix. This is a slide I like to use with executives or boards when I brief them on cybersecurity things, is a mindset shift. I tell them, please stop asking, are we safe? If your boss comes into you, if you're a CISO or CIO or cybersecurity leader, and they say, hey, we're safe, right? We just spent $1 million on EDR licenses and firewalls and whatever else. That's the wrong question to be asking, because the bottom line is, if you've got a well-resourced and motivated adversary, nobody's really safe. They will be able to figure out a way in. The better question and the better mindset to have is, are we prepared? It's not generally a question of if we're attacked, it's when we're attacked. Do we have an incident response plan? Do we have retainers in place? Do we have mitigating controls? Do we have a trained team, or have we outsourced that? Have we practiced it with tabletop exercises? Those are the things that we want our bosses to be thinking of in our leadership, not, okay, we spent some money on cyber, we're not going to hear about you guys for a while, and we must be safe. The other mindset thing to walk through with them is, look, we can't prevent threats. We've got people that are coming after us. We've got script kiddies just scanning for vulnerabilities and trying to attack us. We might have motivated adversaries, depending on your organization, that are trying to come after us. We may even have insider threats trying to do things, but we can't prevent whether or not somebody comes after us. But if we do some of the things that I've talked about in this course and some other things too, our role isn't to prevent threats. Our role is to influence the outcome when we are attacked. Just like we looked at that car, whether it was parked inside the garage or outside, or the houses that had the wildland fire coming toward them, whether they've got defensible space and fire-resistant materials versus no protection whatsoever. Those are what we want to focus on. Those kinds of things as cybersecurity professionals is, when those things happen, do we have incident response plans? Do we have monitoring and detection and response capabilities and the ability to remediate and backups? And we've done a risk assessment. We have a risk register. Those are all the things that we want to be doing and talking to our leadership about. Is What we're trying to do is influence the outcome when a cyber attack comes our way, not to just prevent every cyber attack from ever being to get to us. We covered a lot of ground with risk management and risk assessments and just the foundation of risk management for cybersecurity. I hope you found it helpful and valuable. If you have a question or comment, please leave it below. I read all of them, and if you have a question, I'll do my very best to respond to it. Also, I'd ask you, please subscribe to our newsletter. I've got the link down below on Substack, so you can get notified weekly of cybersecurity news and events, our latest trainings, and products that are available. If you watch this through YouTube, I'd ask you to like the video if you found it helpful, subscribe to learn about future content and offerings, and please check out natsar.com for other things that we have, both available at no cost and paid offerings as well. If any of this is something that you are interested in and want to work together more with Natsar for, whether it's career coaching, helping with building a risk assessment for your business, doing incident response planning, or tabletop exercises, please get a hold of me. I'd be glad to talk to you and help wherever I can. And again, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you very much for your time.